Welcome to the Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs podcast, a place for podcasters to learn what's actually working in the world of podcasting and how to use their podcast to generate consistent leads in their business. I'm your host, Jenny, and I'm so excited you're here.
Hey, Savvies. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. In today's episode, we are diving into the different types of podcast formats. And honestly, there are so many different types of podcast formats, but since this is a podcast about podcasting for entrepreneurs specifically, I'm only going to be covering the three formats that I think work for business owners, entrepreneurs, that kind of thing. So let's just hop right in. So first up, we have interview format. So interview format is when you have a podcast that strictly interviews others about their expertise. So you ask them the questions, they respond. It's a conversation, but an interview. You don't really give your input as frequently because you are asking them the questions. So let's first talk about some of the pros of the interview format. So first up, one of the pros is that it allows for engaging and dynamic content. So with interviews, your audience really gets to connect with a variety of different people who bring new perspectives to the table. So it's pretty interesting and can be fun for your listeners to get to hear from someone new every single week that has a different perspective, different life experiences, things like that. It's really interesting. The second pro is that you don't have to think of new episode ideas as often. So you don't really have to worry about thinking of a new topic each week. Obviously, if you want to curate your guests, then you might need to have general topics you want to cover, but you're not sitting there outlining it from top to bottom and things like that. But to make this easier, make sure to get a guest application set up on your website, because as your show becomes more well-known, people are going to start reaching out to you to be on the show. So that really takes some of the guesswork out of it for you for finding people to interview on your show, because you're having these applicants, you can go through them and say yes to ones who are a good fit and no to ones who aren't. And it gives you a lot more options. It opens that pool instead of just relying on your network of people that you know. So the third pro is that interviewing people is fun, and it really helps you continue to build connections with people in the online space. So I'm personally huge on collaborations, and I really enjoy guest interviews because it's an easy and fun way to get to know others better and form long-lasting collaborative relationships with those people. And I know I've had a podcast since 2018, so I've had guests since 2018. So I've built a lot of relationships through my podcast over the years. It's been really fun to continue to collaborate with those people down the line, whether that be via summits or bundles or, being on their podcast or in their collaboration opportunities. It's just been really great. So highly, highly recommend interviewing people for this collaborative thing. That's probably one of my favorite part about having interviews on a show. And the last pro is that you have the ability to attract a larger audience. So having guests on your show can be beneficial because your guests can share their episode with their own audience and bring more people to your show, which in my opinion is a total win-win, because who doesn't want more listeners? So it allows you to have a bigger marketing reach and not have to rely on only promoting yourself or doing paid ads or whatever that may be. Now let's dive into the cons. So the first con is that with a strictly guest interview-based podcast, you are really reliant on guest availability. So you're relying on these people to get on your show to produce new content. And sometimes you might have a challenging time trying to fill a spot, whether that's due to a last-minute cancellation or something else out of your control. So that can be really frustrating if you're relying on guests, because you may not always have a place for them. And then the second con is that there's less focus on you as the host. So with an interview format, sure, you can sort of show up as the expert in the midst of conversation with your guests, but it's definitely harder for you to stand out as a host when you're interviewing someone new each and every week. Your audience doesn't really get to know you as much because you're asking the guests the questions instead of sharing your own expertise. And sure, you might be able to pop in with your own experiences, but you're not going to make it all about you because that's not what it's about. So that's another con. And then the final con is that you have less control over the content. So obviously you can craft the questions in advance, but you don't know how the guest is going to answer those questions, which leads to you having less control over the content. However, since it is your podcast, if an episode truly doesn't meet your expectations in any way, shape, or form, you can choose to not air that episode. So, I mean, you still do have control over the content, just, in a different way. All right, the next format is solo format. So that means it is 100% you behind the microphone with no guests whatsoever. You're doing all the episodes by yourself. Okay, let's dive into the pros first. So the first pro is that this really enhances your personal brand. So the focus is 100% on you, like I said. So it's an amazing opportunity to grow your own brand and become the go-to expert in your niche because you are at the forefront of every single episode. The second pro is that there is lots of flexibility and convenience. So I don't know about you, but sometimes I like to record my podcast episodes at 8 p.m. in the evening, and that's a lot harder to do when you're working around other people's schedules. So the solo only format really allows you to have more flexibility when it comes to your content, recording times, and things of that sort. And then the final pro for solo format is increased efficiency. In my opinion, solo episodes are much easier to handle in the post-production process. There's just a little bit less room for errors, and there's typically like a much shorter episode format than guest episodes, so your post-production process will be a lot easier. Now let's talk about the cons. So the first con is that it's always you all the time, and that can be a lot of pressure. So coming up with new episodes each week and always being the one having to be behind the mic can be challenging sometimes. So it's just a lot of pressure, and you need to be aware of that. The second con is that there's a potential for burnout. So when you are the only one behind the mic, it can start to lead to burnout. I know that seems a little bit weird, but I feel like running a solo show can sometimes be more draining than a guest show or a hybrid show because the pressure is all on you, and that's a lot. Number three, the potential monotony. So, of course, people show up to listen to your podcast to hear you every week, but if there's no variety, there is a slight potential for monotony. So just keep that in mind if you're deciding to do a strictly solo format. And then the last con here is that you're the only one marketing your episodes on a regular basis. So when you don't have guests on your show, you're solely responsible for marketing these episodes. Now, I'm definitely not saying the only way to grow your show is to have guests because that is not true whatsoever, but it can certainly be helpful if your guests are sharing their episodes and they have a really engaged audience. Because I know that I have seen some uptick because a guest of mine shared their episode with their audience, and that has been really beneficial. And now we're diving into the final format here that we're going to be talking about today, which is the hybrid format. And this is where you have a mix of solo episodes and guest interviews. So in my opinion, this is my favorite format because it gives you and your audience the best of both worlds. But it's okay if you prefer one of the others over the hybrid format. Totally fine. So let's first jump into the pros. So I have 3 pros for you. So it gives your audience more variety. And I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of variety, especially when it comes to business focused podcasts. So being able to hear both solo and guest episodes on the same show is very appealing. And I'm probably not alone in this. You probably like variety too, or you might prefer solo or strictly guest. But I don't know. I'm just all about the variety over here. The second pro is that it allows you to build connections. Plus, in addition to those connections, you also are building a solid personal brand. So, building connections by having guests and showcasing your own expertise in solo episodes, count me in. No, but really, it's really nice to have both. And I really enjoy that connection piece, which I've talked about before. But obviously, it's important to have a really great personal brand. So, having both gives you the best of both worlds. And then the last pro is that you get more flexibility. So I love being able to plug guest episodes in alongside my solo episodes. It really takes some pressure off of me to always be thinking of new episodes, but also makes it so I'm not having to worry about constantly finding new guests for the show. So it's a really nice balance. And now we have 2 cons. So there is some potential for content overlap. I don't really feel like this will be an issue for a lot of people, but since my own podcast is super niche about podcasting, there's only so many topics that people can talk about. So you may need to be careful here and make sure that your solo episodes and guest episodes are different enough so people aren't getting the exact same content from different people. Like I know I get a lot of different pitches about being on other podcasts, and that's something I talk about frequently. And, I don't want to, have conflicting information or just the same information being shared too much, because it can be kind of like oversaturated and not great. And then the last con is that there's increased workload compared to a strictly solo podcast. So a strictly solo podcast is going to be a lot easier production-wise than a hybrid format or even guest format. So just keep that in mind, because guest episodes require more editing, they require more promo creation, and they require more communication overall. So I would love to know, which podcast format do you prefer? Let me know over on Instagram. My handle is Podcasting for Entrepreneurs. I'd absolutely love to hear from you. It's always great to talk to you guys. And yeah, if you want to check out the show notes for this episode, head over to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com, and I will see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, and leave a review. You can find us at savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com and on Facebook at Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs and Instagram at Savvy Podcasting. Make sure to join our free Facebook community for podcasters by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com/community and join in on the exclusive community just for Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs listeners. I'll see you there.